to Mr. Doggett.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, there is considerable bipartisan agreement behind this proposal. Indeed, 8 Democratic members of the committee and 11 Republicans are sponsors of this legislation. This markup follows a subcommittee hearing on the issue of preventing sex trafficking for children in foster youth that we had in October. We posted the draft bill for public comment in December and have received a number of comments. And we introduced the bill in February, myself, Chairman Reichert, Chairman Camp, and a number of other committee members. The Children's Defense Fund has said that this measure, quote, strengthens the child welfare system to help prevent children and youth in foster care from becoming victims of sex trafficking in the future. However, I am very disappointed to have learned for the first time yesterday that the substitute that will be offered momentarily eliminates an important provision that would ensure that older children who are discharged from foster care are provided with important documents upon their release: a copy of their birth certificate, their Social Security card, and their medical records. Now, think a minute about who these children are who would get these documents. These are children who stand among the least in our society. They've been removed from their parents because of physical abuse or neglect. Many of these cases are so horrendous that it is difficult to consider the details, and they're lucky to have survived. Then that same child often gets passed around from one foster home to another as the child grows. They have no sense of stability or belonging to a family, school, or community in many cases. And then for most of these children, when they reach 18, they don't get a birthday cake with 18 candles. They're told, you're on your own, good luck, find a job, you're out of foster care. And often this is in areas where youth unemployment is soaring. Is it any wonder why a number of young women who, the term is age out of foster care, prostitute themselves and become victims of sex traffickers? Is it any wonder that so many of these foster youth are now in our criminal justice system, subsidized by the taxpayers after having done harm to a neighbor? Indeed, when I met with a number of people working with these youth last week in San Antonio, I learned that only about 2% of them actually end up going to college. Many get additional taxpayer assistance only in the form of the criminal justice system. I support the bipartisan provision that was included in the bill that was posted that says at least give them a Social Security card, a birth certificate, and the information on health records that they obtained through the foster system so that they'll be more likely to get a job and less likely to get in trouble. This provision has been removed not because it's not worthy, not because it doesn't have bipartisan support. In fact, I think Senator Orrin Hatch first advanced it, but for one and only one reason. It costs a little more than $1 million a year for the states to implement that they can charge back to the federal government on their administrative costs. Compare this with the other bills on today's agenda. Against the huge tax breaks that the committee is considering today, the amount of this amendment for some of our most desperate young people is a pittance. If you ever needed to see a concrete example of the trade-offs between corporate tax breaks and support for the most vulnerable in our society, it can be found right here in the little more than $1 million a year that is being denied to young people to have a better chance of getting a job, something that even my home state of Texas does already, not known for its generosity and services. So I support the bill, I support the technical changes, but I would offer an amendment to at least give these children a chance in the future to get a job by having the documents that they need. The cost of this is hours or days of the unpaid $310 billion of corporate tax bills that the committee is about to pursue. I think that there's justification for providing this small bit of assistance to our most vulnerable youth at a time that we are responding so generously to what seem to be invulnerable corporate interests, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your comments. My goal is to get this provision restored and to work with you in a constructive way to do so. But I do want to clarify the record on this. My understanding is that the only discussion with staff was to point out that a cost had been found for doing this that the states would incur, and they could seek reimbursal as they do in other ways, and that therefore the cost of this provision to the federal government would be about $1 million a year in additional costs. And the presentation was to the effect of, do you have a pay-for to cover that? And the Democratic staff is not the only folks around here responsible for finding pay-fors and could not identify one at the time, and therefore the provision was removed. In other words, the provision was removed to address the needs of these at-risk kids who are basically dumped on the street in many cases, can't find employment, don't have other means of supporting themselves, and too many of them turn to prostitution. And I thought that this provision, which I did not originally conceive, was a modest way of addressing that. At least say so they can go flip burgers or do whatever other task they might do, that they'll have a Social Security card, that they'll have their health records to show their employer, and that they'll be a little bit more employable. And it just smacks of such inconsistency to, on this day, lead off with a bill that has this key provision removed that cost only about $1 million a year and not be concerned about approving $310 billion. In other words, the cost of this bill as currently drafted is maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 days of the unpaid tax breaks that are about to be approved in the committee. It is a cost that is very real, and it is a trade-off. It is a question of whether we provide some minimal services to help these desperate young people, and that we insist that that must be paid for, as I think it should be, but that we are unwilling to pay for provisions, some of which, frankly, I don't think are worth being paid for, but we're unwilling to pay for any of the provisions in the corporate tax breaks that are being considered today. It is an incredible conflict in priorities where we can't do $1 million a year for desperate youth, but we can do $310 billion over the next 10 years in significant corporate tax breaks that are not being paid for. I think it's wrong. I think it's the wrong set of priorities. The Senate has already approved a bill with this provision in there. Since my goal is to try to get this included in the bill, I will work with you going on to the floor to see if there isn't some way to get the bill that 11 Republican members of this committee have already co-sponsored with this provision in there, a provision that was posted and got comments for several months from the public, none rejecting this, and to have it removed for the cost of about $1 million a year is just flat wrong.